Hello and welcome back. So in the last lesson, we learned a little bit about this Gatsby source file system plugin. So plugins are pretty much these tools that we can include inside of our Gatsby config in order for our Gatsby processes to get these bonus features. So for example, our source file system, as we know, gave us access to that all file query inside of our GraphQL queries on our web. Now, the next thing that we need to add is actually going to be a new plugin that is called a transformer. The transformer will allow us to take these files that we are pulling into our query using the all file query. That gives us a node representation, but we actually want the data that sits inside of those files. So we need a transformer to do that. The thing that we have to note, though, is that transformers tend to be libraries that we need to install inside of our project. Now, if you look inside of your directory, you might see a yarn lock file. If you see a yarn lock file, it means that by default, this project comes with yarn. If you see a package lock file, then you actually don't have yarn installed. Instead, what you're using is just npm. What we're going to do is we're just going to add this new file, and depending on what you have, whether it's yarn or npm, just use the respective one. In order for you to add a new file in npm, you do npm install, and then you type the name of the file, or the package that we're adding. If you're using yarn, you're just going to do yarn add, and then the name of the package that we're adding. Now, the name of the package is Gatsby transformer remark. So simply add that in with your respective package manager, depending on how your folder structure looks. And what this will do is this will add in this new transformer object that we need to plug into our application. So you simply add these backticks here and you type in Gatsby transformer remark. Now, what Gatsby transformer remark does is it is a plugin that allows us to convert our markdown files into data and HTML. The front matter portion of our markdown will get converted into a data object that we can access, and everything in the actual markdown itself will be converted into HTML that we can use to build the pages that we want inside of our application. Now, keeping this in mind, the other thing we have to do is remember to restart our server because we've added a new plugin. In order for us to actually access what we're going to see with our transform remark is that once this server finishes rebuilding, we get access to this new query inside of our GraphQL. So let's just wait until this finishes building. And we'll go back to our GraphQL and we'll refresh. Now what we'll see is this thing called all markdown remark. So if we add this and we simply fire this off, we see that now we only get 2 nodes. The reason for this is because these are actually our markdown nodes. So in order for us to see inside of the node itself, here we have our front matter, where we have an optional description, the title, and the date, as well as this HTML block, which represents the actual body of the markdown that we've written. So we fire this again. Here we see that the HTML holds the markdown, but now converted into HTML, as well as our front matter object that holds our description, our title, and our date. Now, description, of course, is optional. That's why in some places we get null because we don't include one. So we just have to account for this when we actually build out our blog template. Now, another property that we see that we have is this excerpt. Now, the excerpt, unlike the HTML, is what will give us this little snippet of what we're trying to show. So this is pretty much the body of our markdown, except it truncates it automatically for us. Now, this is really good when we want to actually show or highlight something inside of our blog preview, for example, where we don't want to show the full body, but maybe just an excerpt from the top of it. So we want to use this property inside of our index page, for example, where we actually list out our blogs. So what we're going to do is exactly that next. We're going to go to our index page, and what we're going to do is we are going to bring in the GraphQL query so that we can actually start requesting for that data that we just wrote inside of our GraphQL. So what we want to do is we want to copy this GraphQL, and then after where we export out our actual index page, we want to make sure that what we export is a query. So we're just going to export const query, which is equal to this GraphQL request. And inside, we're going to say it's a query. And then we're going to copy over this object that we wrote before. Now, Gatsby is smart enough to know that if you export out something that has this GraphQL almost body to it, that this is probably a query that you want to use and pass into whatever component you're exporting out by default. Now, we still have to export out our component by default. And if we want to make this a bit more clear, we don't have to export it like this. We can just copy our export default text and replace this index page like so. So by default, we're just automatically exporting out our function that represents the actual component that we want to render for our index page. And now what we're going to do is we're going to get in that props object. And on that props object will be the data object that is our query return. So using that data, we're going to now end up creating some kind of default look to our index page that shows us our list of blog posts. So what we're going to do is we are just going to make sure that there is a div here. We can actually keep this SEO at the top. It doesn't really matter. And inside of this div, we are going to have an H1. And in this H1, we're just going to say Yihua's thoughts. Now, we do also actually want the total count of our blog posts. So in order to do that, let's actually first remove this. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a new property to our all markdown remark called total count. Now, this actually exists right here on our all markdown remark as a property called total count. And as you'll see, what we'll get is the number of nodes that exist inside of this markdown remark. So by doing this, we're now able to access it inside of our data object. So we're just going to make an H4 that says a JavaScript interpolation of data.allMarkdownRemark.totalCount. And now if we save and we go back to our actual application, we see that we have our count here. Now, let's actually log out the data to see what else we have access to before we continue. Because the shape is actually going to represent the query, but let's just make sure. It doesn't hurt to always double check. Now, if we open up our console, we'll see this object that represents our data. On it, we see our all markdown remark, and inside of it are edges. Inside of our edges array is each element that has our node property, and then on the node property has those fields that we requested in our query. So as we can see, the object that we get back resembles the exact shape of the object that we passed into our GraphQL query. So this format matches exactly this format. So that's really great for us because now we know roughly what it is that we need to use on this element in order to actually build out our blog previews. So what we're going to do is we are going to make another JavaScript tag and we're going to say data.allMarkdownRemark.edges.map. So we want to map over each edge. And on each edge, we want the node object that we saw. So each of these. And what we're going to do is we are going to return back a div where the key is equal to the node ID. And then inside of each div, we're going to have a title. So let's just use an H2 for now. And what we'll render right here is our node.frontMatter. Actually, this might be lowercase all dot title. And we're also going to put a tab here that also loads the date. Actually, instead of an H2, let's use a span, just so that it's not too big. And then after we have this span, we are also going to put a p tag. And in the p tag is where we'll put our excerpt. Now, if we save and we go back, we see that our blog data is showing up. So it's not styled yet, but so far it's all perfectly fine. So that's one of the great things about Gatsby, is that by leveraging the flow that Gatsby expects us to use, as well as tinkering around with some of the code, we're now able to pull in our Markdown files as the data that we use to actually populate this index page. So this is great because whenever we add new Markdown files now to that Markdown pages folder, we will automatically be able to pull it into our index.js with our GraphQL query. And as you would expect, our data would simply just populate out and give us new blog samples inside of this index without us ever having to modify that code. So this is really great. Now in the next lesson, we're actually going to build out these blog post pages individually because right now we can't link to them. We're simply displaying it in our index. So let's do that in the next lesson.